Innovation Rockstars. Innovation Rockstars.
Today with Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Jake Sotiriadis from the U.S. Air Force.
Hi, and welcome back to the Innovation Rockstar interviews. My name is Chris Mühlroth, and today I am honored to welcome Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Jake Sotiriadis, Senior Futurist and Chief of Strategic Foresight at the U.S. Air Force. In his role, Jake spans the nexus of disruptive technologies, geopolitical risk, intelligence, and alternative futures. He also holds a PhD in political science and geopolitical futures from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and various master's degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, and the Air Command and Staff College. And in addition, Jake was the first officer of the Air Force serving in the role of political advisor fellow at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. And if there are a few minutes free in between, he is also a frequent keynote speaker in fluent English, Greek, German, and Spanish. Jake, thank you so much for joining us today. It is an honor having the opportunity to discuss with you today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Now let's kick things off. Jake, can you take us on a quick journey through your career so far?
Absolutely. It's actually a bit ironic, but my career, in my opinion, actually began in Germany in 1998 when I was still a senior in high school. And that's when I came to Germany as an exchange student through the Congress Bundestag exchange program. And I lived with a German host family, finished my senior year of high school in Germany, made so many friends, traveled all over Europe. And it's really that trip that gave me the inspiration, I think, to get out and explore the world. It really set me in motion, building on my interests of history and political science and foreign policy, because I was able to live it and I was able to see how interacting with different people really changes one's worldview. And so from there, I commissioned into the Air Force right out of college after I graduated from Norwich University. And I've served as an Air Force intelligence officer now for 18 years, so almost 2 decades. And I've had lots of experience with all sorts of intelligence operations, with air operations, everything from working with unmanned aerial vehicles to traditional intelligence analysis type functions. I've served multiple tours here on the staff at the Pentagon. And then in my current job, I am the Air Force's, as you mentioned, senior futurist, where my team develops methodologies that helps our senior leadership build anticipatory thinking so that they can ultimately make better decisions. And I will tell you that today, in 2021, in the midst of everything that's happened in this pandemic, it is quite an interesting and fun and a very rewarding job, and we really love it.
Yeah, I bet that. And now you got me excited. You know, foresight or future studies is, as we all know, right, not predicting the future or fortune telling, but it's rather an academic discipline, right, to foster, as you said, anticipatory thinking, to aid decision making. It's about identifying weak and emerging signals and sources, possible sources of disruption. And as I learned, foresight also differs from traditional trend analysis, primarily in the trend analysis, typically extrapolates development taking place today, somewhat linearly into the future, but it tends to neglect deviations from that. Now, Jake, given your background, I'm really curious, how did you become a futurist?
Well, that's a great question because it wasn't something that I had necessarily set out to do, but I think it was a natural combination of my background, having a real interest in history. So what people don't tell you is that futurists are actually all closet historians, and historians make great futurists because they understand how things in the past have transpired and they can make a connection to what's happening in the present environment. So I think that background combined with a lot of my international affairs experience, interest in policy issues, foreign policy, when I came to the University of Hawaii to be a research fellow in the Center for Future Studies and then pursue my doctoral degree there, it just all came together. But that wasn't the whole story. It was really when I came, so I mean, I had been doing sort of futurist research my whole life, just not knowing it, but was able to bring it all together through my formal education at the University of Hawaii. But when I came to Washington for the second time and brought those skill sets at that right moment in time where there was a true need for it, I think that that's really where we took off. And we were able to build from scratch, from the ground up, our team of futurists who are doing really important work for our national security enterprise. And I think also beyond the Air Force, we're seeing so much interest from the private sector, from universities, from people in general who are excited about learning about this new way of thinking.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And Jake, let's dive a bit deeper into the foresight processes of the U.S. Air Force that you have been mentioning before. So, how exactly do you practice strategic foresight today? Can you give us some insight into how you're organized and how you operate?
Absolutely. Well, number one, there's no magic wand, and to be honest, the foresight processes that we're using are not very different at all. In fact, they're based off of what is out in the academic world. If you were to take a course in strategic foresight, primarily it's very influenced by what's called the Manoa School that was developed by Dr. Jim Dater at the University of Hawaii. Of course, based on my experience and having been a student and a research fellow there, it really, I think, is a great way to bring futures into the policy realm. Sometimes we need to be careful because when we're working in a policy type institution, we want to make sure that we can really tie what the research that we're doing to something tangible. We need to understand, because people's time, as we all know, is so limited. And if you're talking only about methodologies and research, it's very hard to make that connection when you have perhaps 5 minutes to make a point or to really bring out something. So what we're doing is exactly what you talked about, and that is using our internal talent to put together a horizon scanning database to understand today's weak signals and emerging trends, because truly the weak signals of today and these emerging trends that we're mapping out will become tomorrow's reality. And so it's important to listen to those weak signals. And that's something that sounds maybe very intuitive, but it's very difficult when you've got multiple email accounts and you're running back and forth from different meetings and you've got hearings and all sorts of things going on. It's so easy to get trapped by the immediacy of the now. And I think what we want to try to do is say, well, you can actually innovate now based off of this methodology. It's going to make your organization's strategy a better strategy because it helps you question your assumptions. It challenges the status quo. And if everybody agrees on one aspect, let's say, of strategic planning, and they've said, well, this is exactly how the future will look, that should be a red flag. That should be a warning signal. Because we've seen too many instances where that's just not the case.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, the more, complex the world gets and all the information you can actually acquire through, as you mentioned, different channels, be it email, be it trend scouting, tech scouting, and all the environmental scanning techniques you also have. I think, navigating through the noise and provide some guidance is becoming even more important over time. What would you say? How would you describe the impact that performing strategic foresight has had on your organization and still has on your organization?
One of the things that I'm most proud of is the collaboration that we've been able to do, not only internal to the Air Force and our Defense Department, but with the private sector, with so many universities who are keen to work with our team. We've learned from them. They've learned from us. It's been a real model for emulation, I think. And I think one of the biggest impacts we've had is taking a report that we published last year, and we can certainly publish a link for our viewers and listeners because it's a widely accessible report. It's been downloaded now thousands and thousands of times. But we've put this futures report, which looks at geopolitical competition after COVID or in a post-COVID world, into a virtual reality format, which really, in my opinion, is a game changer because it's charting a new course for how we consume information, how senior leaders will make decisions. It's wonderful to read a well-researched futures report that's 50 or 60 or maybe 100 pages. But it's something entirely different to sit in front of or to have an immersive experience and actually live those scenarios, see what it looks like, see what they feel like, see what that environment sounds like, and then understand some of the implications of alternative futures to our strategic planning. That's the real value proposition to my mind.
Wow, and I think this is a world's first, isn't it? Like I've never heard of a, alternative futures report or any futures report actually being projected in the, virtual space and virtual reality, and having, not somebody read the report, but actually immerse into these alternative scenarios. That sounds awesome. Let me know when I can do it. I definitely want to try it out. And maybe we can spend a few minutes on the Global Futures Report itself. As you mentioned, the report is all about, alternative futures of geopolitical competition in a post-COVID-19 world. And by the way, the report, I guess, is unclassified, right? So it's available publicly. So let's jump right in. I mean, what alternative futures can we envision for a post-COVID-19 world? Can you give us a glimpse of the contents of that report?
Absolutely. So just sort of a snapshot. What we did, the way that the report is structured, I think is it's pretty exciting because it gives you right up front 4 global scenarios, really that concern the entire world. What would a 2035 world look like through the lens of a continued growth scenario, a systemic collapse, a systemic transformation, or perhaps a disciplined scenario? And the report will give everybody a bit more detail into what all of those scenarios mean and why we pick those titles and the purpose that they serve. But it really, I think, is a way to change the way that we think and just disrupts, frankly, some of our conclusions that we have about the future and how the future can defy accepted probabilities. But then the report also gives us a very specific look in a wide range of areas, anything from competition in space, competition for autonomous systems, China's Belt and Road Initiative, new fault lines, geopolitical fault lines in the Middle East, things like disinformation campaigns, malign influence campaigns. So all of those issues are in the report and they're covered as horizon scanning themselves. And each of those sections also has 4 scenarios. So if you're really interested in transatlantic relations, which I'm sure for this audience is something of keen interest, there are 4 scenarios. I actually authored that section on transatlantic relations. And we look at a wide range of possibilities. Some things we've already seen play out. As a matter of fact, things like the European Union's initiative now for biodata sharing and consolidating all that type of information. We talked about that in June of 2020. But let me say, the point of the report is not to be right. We are not trying to predict the future, and futurists do not predict the future. That's very important to underscore. What we're trying to do is take these weak signals that we see today and look out based off of an analytic methodology and ask those difficult questions. Would we be ready to face any of these 4 potential scenarios? Are we making the right decisions today? Are our conclusions sound? Would we need to make different investments? Would you need to maybe divest from something? So that's really what we're looking at doing. It's a way of disrupting how we think. And it's not as important to pick, to do sort of a predictive analysis. That's a different type of analysis and an important one, but not necessarily what futurists are doing.
Absolutely agree on that one. And thanks for the overview of the contents of the report. Well, but by the way, what was the most surprising thing or the most surprising fact in your report? What would you say?
I'm not sure if there'd be any one surprising fact that people would see in the report. I think probably the biggest takeaway that people see is that just a short while before the pandemic happened, we would have been talking, if we would have been having this conversation, we would have been talking about all of the chaos in the Middle East because there was a very, very serious geopolitical situation happening. Some news outlets were talking about the potential for World War III, but how quickly that went away. And all of a sudden, we all turned towards the pandemic, which, by the way, many, many people had been talking about. And so it isn't that the pandemic was completely unforeseeable. There were so many people talking and writing about this kind of a thing. But the question was not if we knew that a pandemic was coming, it was if the systems, if the bureaucracies, if we as individuals were able to process that type of catastrophic event. And I think if there's anything that we've learned from that, and frankly, the value proposition of our report, it's that we cannot rest on the status quo as the norm for future planning. We have to have a better way of envisioning these alternative futures. And we have to constantly iterate and question our assumptions, question, sort of that common line of thinking. Because if we don't, we see how events will catch up with us, and the future truly belongs to those who prepare for it.
Right. And I've been discussing some of these aspects, especially around the pandemic, in a previous episode with Kara Koonsman from the Aerospace Corporation. And I asked her just about her opinion, if she thinks, if COVID-19 actually was a black swan event or not. What would be your take on the question? Is it maybe, a black swan event or not?
Yeah, so Kara is wonderful, and she authored actually our section of the report on competition in space. And so we're so happy to work with her and always seek her opinion on space issues. Yeah, I don't think the pandemic was a black swan at all. As I mentioned before, it was something that was very foreseeable. But as with so many issues, and this is a challenge, I think, for futurists, but also for decision makers, there are so many weak signals, there are so many emerging trends out there, and that's really where the talent, I think, of your strategic foresight practitioners comes in, is you have to understand what is, what's important and what isn't. You have to be able to make a distinction. You have to be able to really look at some of these issues in terms of where they fall on what we call an S-curve. Is it in the foresight zone? Is it something that's already being talked about, or is it truly new? Is it truly something that we haven't covered yet, and a phenomenon that we aren't ready to grapple with? And so I think that's a very difficult thing to do. But on the flip side, we also have to help our organizations develop their aspirational futures. And so this is, I think, that futures and strategic foresight, in addition to being a great tool for strategic planning and for questioning our assumptions, it's actually very useful in corporate visioning. And ensuring that, doing this kind of a workshop, doing this process, understanding every individual's buy-in to those aspirational futures and where they fit in that is very, very important. I don't think that the pandemic at all was a black swan.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And having that said, some may argue that strategic foresight methods and processes in the public sector may differ quite a bit from corporate foresight methods and processes in the private sector. And I'm not sure, what my answer to this, or what my judgment on this aspect would be. Do you feel the same? Do you think, public is actually performing foresight methods and processes differently than the private sector? And if so, why is that the case? Or do you see the possibility, for both sectors to actually work together, collaborate, and learn from each other? What's your take on this?
I think that there are certain differences just based on the nature of the work. I think when we talk about something as so critical as national security, there's a different, what's the right word? There's a different approach that's required, and there's certainly a difference in scale and scope when we're talking about complicated national security matters. At the same time, a lot of the underlying methods and approaches that we use in terms of how we do our analysis, I think, are very similar to what I've seen in my interactions and when I talk with my colleagues in the private sector. There's some basic underlying fundamentals of futures that don't change. But I think organizations are different. Or culture matters when we talk about strategic foresight, and organizational culture certainly plays a major role in how organizations see themselves. That's actually something foresight can help us with, is giving our organization sort of an internal look at what it should be, maybe what it isn't, what it wants to be. And I think that that's a very important value proposition when we talk about that. Some of the toolkits, I think what we're seeing now is just an incredible opportunity through private sector partnerships to take advantage of some AI-based platforms that are able to help us just go through massive amounts of data and help us sift through work that would have taken individuals much longer. And we're really we're just at the tip of the iceberg here, where there's so much more potential to be able to unlock that collaboration. And so that's why I think bringing the private sector and the public sector together in these kinds of efforts is a win-win for everybody. And one of the other goals, I think, in writing our report was not only to put out the product, but was really to demonstrate that we are able to bring together a diverse group of thinkers who all wanted to contribute into making this vision of a post-COVID-19 world a better one, and believed in what we were doing. And so I think, again, we're really just getting started. And I will say that there's a bright future for this type of collaboration.
There is most certainly. And when referring to your report, as you just did before, I personally believe it is very informative, and I can only recommend everyone to take a look at it. And as mentioned earlier, the report is unclassified, and therefore it's publicly available. Jake, where and how to get the report?
Sure. People can go to www.afwic.mil, and they are able to see the report on our website.
Great, thanks. And of course, we will, added the link to the show notes of this episode. Now, Jake, coming from the report, now that I have you here, maybe we can also talk a bit about the future of strategic foresight itself. And as we have already been discussing in the beginning, of course, the higher the uncertainty, the higher the need for strategic foresight to, foster anticipatory thinking, support strategic decision making. According to your personal opinion, what do you think the future of strategic foresight will look like maybe in the next 5 to 10 years from now?
Well, I will tell you, I think that we will look back 10 years from now or 5 years from now, and we will say, without question, that the COVID-19 pandemic was really the catalyst for this new renaissance that we're living of strategic foresight. I mean, there just couldn't be a better time now to be involved with strategic foresight than the time we're living in. Now, I will say, we lament the great human cost and the loss of life that's taken place during this time. And it's been so difficult for all of us, for our children who are maybe going to virtual school, for so many of us who can't see relatives, who can't go to their places of worship. We all understand the disruption. But on the flip side, this opportunity that's been presented now, I think, where the whole world has been given a mental reset, if you will, and just a wider acceptability of this kind of thinking, I think is unprecedented. And so I think you're going to start seeing, in short order, corporations that now have everything from a chief diversity officer to a chief learning officer to a chief wellness officer. I would not be surprised if corporations began adding chief futures officer or chief futurist to the C-suite. That's something that I think perhaps the security establishment is going to be looking into as well. And I think that the recognition that this is a skill set that is in high demand and can truly make a difference. Because we don't want to just add things to create more offices. We want to add something that truly brings value, that makes our organization better, that helps us do our job better. But I think that's something that we would be able to look toward in 5 to 10 years. I think more programs, more academic programs, or more interest in academic programs, because there already is incredible interest now. I've just seen this last year, so many people have reached out, so many people have expressed interest in following this line of study. But I would imagine you'll see universities also adopting more of these kinds of classes, combining this type of work with some great work in design thinking that's already out there, with game theory, even aspects of political science and political psychology. There's so many interesting parts to this equation. So I do think we are living a renaissance, and we're just getting started. And it's in one sense, we're actually reintroducing strategic foresight to many people, because really we shouldn't forget that the discipline itself was developed here in the United States after the Second World War, and it was used for a lot of the strategic planning, and it's just ebbed and flowed over the last decades. But now I think we're coming to a place of recognition of how truly important it is.
Yes, absolutely. And as we talk about the renaissance of strategic foresight, and by the way, I think the rise of the chief futurist officer would definitely make a good title for exciting research and exciting article going forward. But despite that, since we talk about the renaissance, will and also should strategic foresight prevail in the private and public sector? I think you already made a statement on that one. But what could be a possible step forward into the future? How should public and maybe also private organizations position themselves on this topic? One idea certainly might be the introduction of a chief futurist officer or chief futures officer or whatever. But what can private and public organizations do in addition to embrace the topic and to position themselves early for the next decade?
Well, I think we have to recognize, and organizations would do well by seeing the potential that their workforce has. I mean, each individual has within ourselves an innate nature, an innate ability to think or imagine how the future could be different. That's nothing very complicated. So the question is, are we giving our colleagues the proper tools and toolkits to be able to bring out that potential and harness their valued thought in their day-to-day work? Part of that has to do with the fact that, today we're much more concerned with immediate solutions, instant gratification. Everything needs to become a smartphone app, right? Otherwise we won't pay attention to it. But what we should be doing instead is we should be creating what I call a cognitive operating system. And that is the model moving forward that I think we need to follow. And the cognitive operating system really is asking us to see the interconnectivity of events, understand, to challenge our status quo, challenge our assumptions, and then embrace complexity in our thinking. Not recognizing that something is complicated, but true complexity, understanding that there is a multi-source causality to a particular issue, that it's not just a point A to point B solution. So building towards that cognitive operating system, whether that's in the private sector, whether that's in the public sector, the model will be different depending on the needs of the organization and the individuals. But I think overall, that is one important step to take to realizing that sort of renaissance we're talking about of strategic foresight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a great mission to be on. I'm really excited, Jake, to see how this all plays out in the midterm future, and definitely see the opportunity, embracing complexity somewhat. Past discussions that I had also hint towards, the necessity to have a bit more skills in the area of data literacy, for example, right? So obviously, if you have signals coming from so many different sources and you have to differentiate between what is a weak signal, what is an emerging trend, what is actually something that might play out on a bigger scale, I think it's, getting even harder and more complex to not only collect all this information, but also to evaluate it, to make sure you're drawing the right conclusions. You are not only collecting the dots, you're connecting the dots. So this is definitely calling for maybe a new role, maybe a new era of foresight. And I think, embracing that kind of complexity and change is maybe a first step for not even only private, but also public organizations to say, well, okay, this is what we can do. And let's now, try to organize our teams and our future thinking around that. So thanks for that statement. I think this is really, really an important mission that you are on. I mean, we've almost reached the end of this episode, but There is one last question that I'm very curious to hear the answer to. It's a bit of an unusual question, but let's see. Now, looking back on your career in your role as a senior futurist and chief of strategic foresight, what would you say was your most, let's say, impressive innovation rockstar moment to date, if you can call it an innovation rockstar moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, number one, and this is it's always a team effort. It's always bringing people together, I think, is such an important thing to do and harnessing that talent. But I would say, really, the fact that we were able to create our team and we were able to fill that critical need. We were able to create our strategic foresight and futures team within our Air Force Futures office, within our directorate at the Pentagon, because we did this, we had, if you will, the foresight to make that recommendation well before the pandemic had happened. And so we were already starting to look at a lot of critical issues and understand how important it is to think about the future differently, especially when we talk about something as important as national security. And so I'm proud of the fact that we were able to do that, and that also that we had leadership and we had leaders, senior leaders in our department who trusted us. And so that was a two-way street. That trust was there. They gave us the flexibility. They gave us the room to experiment, which I'm grateful for. And on the flip side, when that critical moment in history came, I feel very pleased to say that we were able to help the organization at least deal with some of the fallout and think differently about how we could approach that difficult question of what should our next steps be after the pandemic? How will this affect our national security? How will this affect the Air Force that we want to have? And then ultimately partner with other organizations within the United States and then also abroad in really answering that question. How do we make global futures for the planet that are more aspirational?
That is a really inspiring statement at the end of the interview. And I would leave it exactly as it is. Jake, thank you so much for the fantastic interview and your insights into your mission and thought leadership on strategic foresight. It definitely was a pleasure to listen to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
And to our audience, if you want to dive deeper into the topic of strategic foresight, scenarios, or alternative futures in general, I encourage you to read through the Global Futures Report Jake and I discussed in this episode. And of course, we will link it, to it in the show notes of this episode. And for any other topics, feel free to drop us a note at info@innovation-rockstars.show. Now that's it for this episode. Thanks for joining. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Innovation Rockstars.
This was Jake Sotiriadis from the U.S. Air Force about alternative futures and the golden age of strategic foresight. If you want to dive deeper into these topics, or if you'd simply like to give us feedback on this episode, just email us at info@innovation-rockstars.show. For more exciting contributions from our podcast series, as well as the link to the Global Futures Report, visit our new website at www.innovation-rockstars.show or browse through our Innovation Rockstars channel on all major podcast platforms.